Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Diversability Amplified, the podcast where we elevate disability pride together through conversation and stories. I am your host, Katherine Lewis, the content manager for the Diversability team, and my pronouns are she, her, and I am so excited to be here with Lissie Cox, disability advocate and digital creator, to have a candid conversation about the intersection of disability, pride, and fatphobia. Before we get started, I am a Caucasian woman with long dark hair and glasses. I'm wearing a dark black shirt and I'm sitting in my office where behind me you can see a bookshelf and some of my home decor. Lissie, welcome. We're so excited to have you. Can you please introduce yourself to our audience? Tell us a little bit about you. This is Katherine. I'm done speaking.
Hey, I'm Lissie. I am a white, pale, freckled fat woman with curly, dark hair, short, and I'm wearing a pink and white gingham dress. I am a life fat, meaning I have been fat my entire life, and that's basic. And I'm a digital creator, and I don't know what else to say about myself.
No, that's totally fine. This is Katherine. Thank you so much for introducing yourself. Lissie is a phenomenal advocate in the digital space for disability justice, disability pride, and also size equity and equality. So let's go ahead and dive into that conversation about how those two experiences intersect and what that experience is, what that identity is, and why it's so important to talk about. Can you tell us a little bit about your personal experience being a disabled and self-proclaimed fat woman in modern society? Can you tell us a little bit about what that dual experience is like for you?
Yeah, so this is Lissie speaking, and like I said, I'm a life fat. I've been fat my entire life. I was a chunky kid, and I'm a fat adult, and it definitely made I'm chronically ill. I'm also low vision, going blind, but the main thing that fatness intersects with is my chronic illness, and it made getting diagnoses hard. It has made gaslighting from doctors a huge issue. Being fat and disabled, chronically ill has I don't feel like I fit into either community necessarily, because a lot of the fat community is like, oh, it's okay that I'm fat because I'm healthy, and a lot of the disability, like what you see pictured for disability, is thin people. So it's definitely like it's an intersection that a lot of people live in, but doesn't get enough representation, in my opinion.
This is Katherine speaking. I'm so glad that you said something about the representation of like your experience, because I feel like it's a growing conversation, especially like in the disability advocacy space, of like, hey, this community needs representation and we need to make sure that disabled people are represented, but we don't necessarily have a really close look at what a disabled person looks like, or what a disabled person, what those other identities are, because there are so many intersections in the disabled community. And yet you're right, it tends to be a very narrow experience that is even getting represented. And so many advocates, talk about how, well, at least a step towards the right direction is a win, but is it really? Can you answer that question for us? Because that's a really big I think, question that the community and advocates alike are grappling with right now is how much of a win is acceptable for the community as far as representation goes. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
This is Lissie speaking, and in my opinion, I think it is a win to get disability out there in the mainstream world, but also it's not enough of a win to like, yeah, we can celebrate it. It's great. Like Selma Blair coming out with her chronic illness diagnosis. That's great. Like that's a huge thing, like disability on the mainstream. But then there's no like fat disability. There's not a lot of disabled people of color out on the mainstream. And I really think that it is a win, and it is wins when we get like any sort of representation. And I do think it's okay to celebrate that. I just think it also makes a lot of people who aren't being represented, it can really be triggering or discouraging, if that makes sense. Because we already feel like we don't fit in. And so when people are celebrating, like, you know, that, and it just feels like it adds to that we don't fit in feeling. Yeah.
This is Katherine speaking. Thank you for highlighting that, because and especially the fact that like there are a number of intersecting communities who in the effort to get disability in the mainstream, we run the risk of leaving out. And that's why these conversations like what we're having today are so important, to remind the advocates and the community at large that representation of all disabled souls, all disabled bodies is imperative to the movement towards actually celebrating and elevating disabled pride. I want to back up just a minute and talk about some of the bias and stigma that you kind of touched on a little bit earlier, with it being more difficult to get diagnosed, and you don't really necessarily fit in either community. How has being, you know, a plus size person in the disabled community and a disabled person in the plus size community, how, and also being both in a non-disabled fat phobic society, impacted your ability and your pride in both of those identities? How has the stigma impacted your ability to pridefully exist in the modern world that is so ableist and so fat phobic?
Yeah, so it's definitely when I first got my diagnoses, which I've been seeking out for years and hadn't gotten because of a lot of medical fat phobia. But when I first got my diagnoses, I was like, oh my God, people are just going to think I'm lazy. People are going to not believe me because I'm fat. And so it took me a long time to really accept that I was disabled. And the same thing when I started using mobility aids, took me a really long time to start using mobility aids. Like I remember I was at the mall and I had my cane in my backpack and I didn't want to take it out, because even though I needed it to get around, I didn't want to take it out because I was like, people are going to judge me. People are going to, I don't look like the image of disability, and people aren't going to get that. And that still goes through my head sometimes. Like I'll get on the scooter cart at Target and people are like, they give me looks and I can tell they're like not sure why I'm on it. And they're not always judgmental looks, but people look when you're fat and disabled and using mobility aids, especially when you're invisibly disabled. And then so it really was hard for a long time to be proud, both of being fat and being disabled, and being fat disabled. It took me a long time, and now I kind of I kind of came to the conclusion that I'm always going to be fat, probably. I'm always going to be disabled unless they find a cure for my eye stuff and my chronic illness, which I don't think is likely. Um, and I realized like, hey, I'm always going to be this way. So, and people are always going to judge it probably in my lifetime. So I might as well just be like, F you, I defying your norms and making my own. And so it's kind of like it works for that little rebellious streak that I've always had to just kind of like defy the norms and be proud of it, because I'm kind of just like, you know, if that makes sense. Um, I don't know where I'm going with this. I ramble a lot. I'm sorry. But this is Lissie speaking.
This is Katherine speaking. You're doing great. I'm loving this conversation. And you're right that, there's so much gaslighting and stigma, and there's so many layers to the bias in our society. It's difficult to pinpoint, oh, I'm being treated this way because of fat phobia, or I'm being treated this way because of ableism. It all overlaps, and all of them are so related to one another that we, in order to address one, we have to address all of them. And that's what brings me to wanting to talk about your digital creation, your influencership, your advocacy. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do in the digital space and how the presence and the work that you do has influenced your pride, both as a disabled and fat person? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is Lissie speaking, and it kind of goes back to what I was saying a minute ago about how like I was afraid to use my cane at first, and then it was like empowering to use it. Part of what made it empowering was posting pictures of me with my cane on Instagram, which is my main platform. And that was just really empowering to me to be like, okay, I'm okay with using my cane. I look good in this photo. I'm gonna post it. And I consider myself kind of like a baby influencer because I'm not completely there yet. Like I'm just starting in the influencer world, if that makes sense. Um, and I a lot of what I do, like a lot of what has attracted brands to me or whatever, is that I'm like raw. I'm like brutally honest about how my medical stuff is going. Like I'm brutally honest about fat phobia and fat liberation. I do a lot of stuff with um disability advocacy. Sorry, brain fog, I can't think of the word. But I do, part of what I do with disability advocacy is just like showing up basically. And I really consider just like being that person that if I could have seen me or someone like me on whatever was I was using at the time. Instagram wasn't really a thing back when I was a preteen teenager. But if I could have seen like someone like me in say like a magazine or something who was fat and disabled and proud of it, it would have helped me really like push for a diagnosis earlier. It would have helped me with accepting myself as a fat person earlier. And so I'm just hoping, like, if I can change one person's life by like being that influence of I'm fat and I'm disabled, and someone who's like fat and disabled and not proud of it yet. And if I can get them to like realize that it's something that you can be proud of, that is like, that's my goal. That's what makes my heart happy to think about, is to like I could be that person for someone like a teenager or something who's going through chronic pain stuff, or try like has no idea that they could even get a diagnosis because they think they're the only reason they hurt is because they're fat, and they've been told that for so long. So it's like, if I can be that person, and I will probably never know if I am that person or not, but I like to think that maybe I will be. And that's what keeps me going on the digital creation platform, if that makes sense. That's like, that's what I want to do.
This
This
is,
is Lissie talking.
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. This is Katherine speaking. I am so excited and humbled that you have such a clear picture for yourself of like your mission to help others have the kind of representation and experience that you didn't have. Because I feel like that is how we move the disability pride movement forward, is trailblazers and really honestly very brave human beings who are willing to challenge the status quo and challenge the kind of bias and intersectional oppression that so many in our community experience and is not a large enough conversation in the movement towards disability justice. So first of all, you are already impacting others because you have impacted my understanding of what it means to be pridefully disabled. I am not life fat like you, but there was I was always the heavier set child. And growing up, I remember when I was a teenager, literally unhealthily losing weight so that my doctors would listen to me. And had I had an influencer or a person like you who would pridefully tell me that I didn't have to do that in order to have my lived experience, it would have completely changed my world. So I can almost guarantee there is someone out there in the world like I was when I was that age who is seeing your content and is understanding that they have so much to be prideful of. And I hope that some of our listeners are able to gather the same kind of profound comfort from the work that you do, because it is so important. It is so important. So thank you for everything that you do, just from a personal note, but also like as someone working with, you know, the Diversability team to help elevate the experience. That also brings me to the fact that like we're all about disability pride here. Aside from your content creation and your advocacy, in your daily life, how do you embrace the intersection of, you know, all of your identities? And what advice can you give to allies to make it easier for those that share your intersections to do so, to be prideful?
This is Lissie speaking, and the first thought that I had was, don't give dirty looks to fat people using mobility aids. Like, that's the first one that came to my mind. But honestly, being fat and disabled is such a weird intersection, because it's like the biggest problem with, like, the biggest challenge that I face is the judgment and the hatred of, like, I mean, honestly, there's hatred of fat people and there's hatred of disabled people. I mean, we see that with the pandemic right now, the hatred of disabled people, or just like the not caring about disabled people. Which, like, oh, I could go on about that, but that's a story for a different day. But yeah, so it's honestly just like showing up for your disabled friends and your fat and disabled friends. Um, my best friend is really great. Like I still struggle with wanting to push myself further than I should with my energy levels and stuff. And my best friend will literally be like, "You're going home, you're exhausted. I'm not, we're, you have to go and rest now, or else you're gonna be dead for a few days. And we don't want that." So just being there for people in your life who are fat and slash or disabled, um, but especially on the disabled side of that, being there for people in your life, looking up their disabilities, if it's something like a physical disability or a chronic illness, looking that stuff up and like reading about it. But that also applies to like other disabilities like blindness or deafness. Just being informed, um, and just like caring about, because a lot of people, a lot of able people will say to disabled people, um, they'll be like, "Oh, you shouldn't make disability your identity." But like for a lot of disabled people, it's a huge part of our identity. Like it it doesn't define me, but it impacts every part of me personally. And I know that's true for a lot of people. Um, so just like doing the work to find out what the person in your life wants and needs, like ask what they need, and then do the research on whatever, that's how I feel like allies can best help disabled people, if that makes sense.
This is Katherine speaking. That absolutely makes sense. Thank you for that advice. For those who are listening today who are non-disabled allies, that is some great, those are great words of wisdom to start by being there for the people in your life who have these intersections. That's how we move this movement forward. Lissie, thank you so much for being here and having this conversation with us. Is there anything that you would like to tell our listeners before we end today's episode?
Just, don't judge people using mobility aids if they're fat, because you never know if they're disabled. That's the key. It's the big thing, because that's what gets to me the most, is being like judged for being both fat and disabled. And when I use my mobility aids, sorry, that's just like, that's always stuck in my head. So just wanted to share that. But I know I already shared it like 3 other times, but there we go.
This is Katherine. It's important advice. And so it's worth sharing time and time again to not judge people, regardless of their intersections, by the way that they look or what our preconceived notions of what fat or what disabled is supposed to be, or what that experience is supposed to be like. That's phenomenal insight to end this episode on. I think that seals everything, that message so well. Thank you, Lissie Cox, for being here today. For those of you who want to connect with Lissie, we will have links to her social media and all of her platforms in the description of this episode, so you can check out her work, connect with her, and help her to continue to grow the conversation about being pridefully fat and disabled, and making the liberation movement a powerful, large, and impactful movement for all of us. Lissie, thank you for being here. And for our listeners, we will see you next time.